Hi, I'm going to talk today a little bit about collecting habitat data whenever you're doing any kind of wildlife study. So no matter what your question is and what your organism is, if you're focusing on animals, whether they be invertebrates or mammals or birds, you're going to be looking at their relationship with their environment. And that's going to include vegetative data to some degree. Now, what data you collect will really be specific to your project, and you need to research that before you decide what you're going to collect. Because if you just go out and try to collect a bunch of variables, you're unlikely to get much pattern in your data, and it'll be frustrating because you will have spent a lot of time collecting habitat data. So I encourage you to look in the literature, speak with your faculty about good types of data to collect depending on your question. So there are a variety of elements in an environment that birds might be cueing into, such as how dark the forest is, how far away a forest is from urbanization. They may be cueing into trees. So woodpeckers are going to be cueing into trees of certain sizes for nesting habitat. They may need dead trees or snags of certain ages for foraging. And so understanding your organism will be key to understanding what kind of habitat data to collect. Now, I have a sort of standard habitat data sheet for point count surveys, and some of these variables might be useful in a variety of studies, although this data sheet is not exhaustive. And so I'm just going to scan over to it, okay, and zoom in a little bit on some of the variables. And I'm going to just walk through some of the variables because they represent some pretty commonly collected types of data. So what you always want to be doing when you collect a survey is connect the identifier that indicates your habitat with whatever point where you were studying. So if you were collecting behavioral data, you'll collect a habitat survey where you observed that animal doing certain behavior. Then you may need to go off and collect some random habitat data to see if their preference is something that's non-random. But if it's a point count, you want to have your habitat data collected at that point. If you're walking a transect, you're probably going to need to establish habitat survey spots along that transect where you're collecting data. So you want to have that reference. So point number 1 in your point count should be 1 in your habitat survey, or however you're numbering them. You want to have a time for your actual behavior or point count. So this is not relating to the habitat, but when you're actually making observations of your animals. And you'll probably collect some weather variables as well. You want to have your latitude and your longitude, and that can be very readily gotten using a GPS unit or a smartphone. All smartphones have a GPS capability. Or you can go into Google Earth when you get back and pinpoint where you were and get your latitude and your longitude, and as well as your elevation. So all that information can be derived from a GPS. You will want to give a basic description of the habitat. So I am standing right here in a mixed coniferous forest, and you can kind of see I'm going to sort of aim my camera up a little bit. And that's how I would describe it. It's mixed coniferous forest, mixed deciduous coniferous forest. And you're going to describe that, and you're also going to describe how much of that area is covered by that forest. And that's the bounds of that's going to be really your plot bounds. If it's a 50-meter radius plot, you will describe what it is in that 50-meter radius. So it really has to do with what you're deciding is the area that you're going to do a habitat survey within. If there's a second type of habitat, often you might be on the edge of a habitat. You're at the edge of a road, or you're on the edge of a transitional habitat, or either you're at the edge of a pond. You might have a second habitat that you're describing and estimating coverage of. You might be near standing water. That's always useful to note. And how much of it is in there by estimating its coverage. If you're next to a stream, if part of what you're doing is studying a stream, you're going to want to estimate its width, and probably some other elements about the stream. If within about 100 meters away from you in any direction, there's a different type of land use, like a farm or a neighborhood, you're going to want to note that. And are you near a road, or are you near a tree fall gap? Are you near some big opening in the canopy somewhere? That's useful to know for birds in particular. And then you might note something about habitat complexity. There's a large body of research that indicates bird diversity and other animal diversity correlates very strongly with habitat complexity. And there's lots of ways you can measure it. And I suggest that you use multiple ways of estimating it. One very simple way is to just simply state what is the number of habitat layers in your environment? And there can usually be up to 4. So you may have an environment where there's a fairly thick herbaceous ground layer, especially this time of year. You may have a layer that consists of woody shrub, what we would call shrubby vegetation, which is typically defined as woody vegetation up to about 3 meters or 9 feet of height. You might have a secondary canopy, so a lower canopy that's mostly closed, and then higher trees up above it, which would be called an upper canopy, and that's 4 layers. And so for each of those layers, you would estimate their density by estimating percent cover. And for secondary canopy and canopy, you're going to want to estimate height. And to estimate height, we used to use this fancy tool that you can still use called a clinometer. And you basically take angles of the tree and you estimate your distance, and you use trigonometry to estimate your tree height. Now there are actually apps on your phone that will allow you to focus on an object that you want to measure the height of. You push a button, you scan from the bottom to the top, and you push the button again, and it will give you a height. And there are some free apps that will allow you to do that for tree height. You might want to estimate, or you will for most wildlife studies, want to estimate canopy cover. And again, we used to have, and we still do have, some fancy tools called densiometers that you can use to estimate canopy cover. But you can also use a smartphone to do that. There are some free apps. I currently have one called Canopy, and there might be some others that are really good, where you're actually using the phone option on your app and making sure you're holding your phone steady and taking some images in different directions and different locations within your plot and getting estimates of canopy cover. There are some other simpler ways, or not simpler, lower tech ways to take tree height and also to get canopy cover. That some of them are mentioned in your book, and some you can easily do a Google search and find some fun low-tech ways to estimate these heights. But if you have a smartphone available, these apps are probably a bit more precise than some of the lower tech ways. You'll also want to be estimating, if you're in a forest habitat, your stem density. And you can do that in a variety of ways. People tend to break their stems into categories of small, medium, and large, or a variety of groups, so that you can basically be doing rapid counts of stems that are sort of medium diameter and small diameter. But you can, you're going to want to know the diameter, and the general limit for stem density estimates is you'll count something as a stem if it is high enough to take a diameter at breast height measurement. And a diameter at breast height measurement is a standard height measurement for measuring trees and revisiting them and measuring them again. And that height it could be your breast height, but the standard diameter at breast height is 4.5 feet or 1.3 meters. So you can count stems that are high enough to do that in different diameter categories. And you can also do the same for standing dead trees, or snags. And those can be really important to measure in the environment depending on what you're looking at. And then dead woody debris is another important element of a forest. And again, you would want to break that in probably into size categories, and you may decide, I only want to be measuring large dead woody debris or small dead woody debris, and you'll have to define what that means in terms of what you will measure. And it often involves measuring a length and a diameter, perhaps at the widest and sometimes at the narrowest point within the bounds of your plot. And so that's some basic habitat information that you can collect in the field, and pretty readily now with all the tools that people have on their smartphones. All right.